The morning air had that crisp, early autumn bite to it, the kind that made the leaves on our maple tree shimmer like they were coated in gold, and for a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, this neighborhood really was the peaceful haven we dreamed about when we moved here 2 years ago, hoping to give my daughter a safe place to grow up despite the challenges she faced every day. Emily was only 12, but life had already made her fight battles that most adults would crumble under. A tragic car accident when she was 7 had left her with partial paralysis on her left side, a traumatic brain injury that still caused unpredictable seizures, and the kind of fragile balance that made walking without her wheelchair nearly impossible. And yet, she smiled more than anyone I knew, finding joy in little things like painting her nails to match the sunset or spending hours in the backyard garden we had built together, planting marigolds and daisies so she could see color explosions every morning when she woke up. That garden was her pride and joy, and every time I saw her there, sunlight catching her auburn hair, I felt a quiet gratitude that we'd survived the accident, that I still had her, no matter how hard the road had been. But not everyone in our little HOA-run neighborhood saw Emily's spirit as something to cherish. From the very beginning, there was Karen. She lived 3 houses down in the 2-story brick home with perfect shutters and a front lawn that looked like it belonged in a magazine, every blade of grass trimmed to the exact same height, every flower in its exact symmetrical place. She never smiled at us. In fact, she never smiled at anyone, unless you counted that smug, tight-lipped smirk she'd flash when pointing out an HOA violation in someone else's yard. At first, I thought her hostility toward Emily was just her general bitterness spilling over. After all, Karen complained about everything: teenagers skateboarding, neighbors leaving trash cans out too long, someone's dog barking for more than 30 seconds. But there was something about the way she looked at my daughter that set my teeth on edge. It wasn't just disapproval, it was something colder, sharper, like she was searching for a reason to hate her. The first time I noticed, it was the week we moved in. Emily was sitting in her wheelchair at the edge of our driveway, watching me carry boxes from the car. When I saw Karen across the street, watering her roses, she didn't wave. She didn't even pretend to be polite. She just stared, the hose dangling in her hand, water pooling at her feet as her eyes narrowed, scanning Emily from head to toe like she was an intruder instead of a child. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself I was imagining things, but the moments kept piling up, Karen accidentally blocking the sidewalk when she saw Emily coming, slamming her door the second our voices carried into the street, muttering something under her breath as she passed us in the grocery store aisle. Still, I told myself it was harmless. Annoying, yes, but harmless. And then came the first letter. It arrived in our mailbox less than a month after we settled in, typed in all caps, and signed but dripping with the kind of venom you could almost smell. It accused us of lowering property values by letting a dangerous eyesore play in the front yard. Her words, not mine. She called Emily a nuisance and claimed her wheelchair blocked pedestrian traffic on the sidewalk. I remember my hands shaking as I read it, my mind scrambling between rage and disbelief, but Emily, sweet, resilient Emily, just asked if she could paint her wheelchair a different color so it would look friendlier. I didn't tell her the truth, that there are some people you can't win over with kindness. Instead, I shoved the letter into a drawer and told myself Karen's cruelty couldn't go any further. But something about her had started to gnaw at me, a quiet, uneasy hum in the back of my mind. I'd catch her watching us from behind her curtains when she thought I wasn't looking, her face lit by the faint glow of a phone screen, thumbs moving fast. Sometimes I'd see her car slow down when driving past, the window rolling down just enough for her to snap a picture before speeding away. Once, on a particularly windy evening, I spotted her across the street in her driveway, talking to one of the HOA board members, gesturing in our direction while holding what looked like a small black case under her arm. I couldn't make out the words, but whatever she was saying made the board member's smile vanish. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept replaying that image in my head, the case, her expression, the way she seemed to be plotting something just out of my reach. I told myself it was probably nothing. After all, what could she really do? But the truth I didn't want to face was that Karen had already crossed a line the day she decided my daughter didn't deserve kindness. And people like that didn't stop on their own. They pushed until something or someone broke. I didn't know it then, but we were already on a collision course, one that would leave our quiet little street forever scarred. And as I watched Emily fall asleep that night, her hand curled around the stuffed rabbit she'd carried since the accident, I felt that cold, creeping dread again, the sense that we were being watched, and that whoever was watching was just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the first real clash happened, the kind of day where the sun blazed so bright it made the sidewalks shimmer and the air felt thick enough to drink, and Emily was outside in her wheelchair, sketching in her art pad while I trimmed the hedges, the soft scrape of her pencil, the only sound between us until Karen's voice sliced through the air like a knife. "You can't park that thing there," she barked from her driveway, pointing at Emily's wheelchair like it was a trash bin left out too long. I froze, pruning shears still in my hand, not entirely sure I'd heard her right, but Emily just blinked at her confused and said softly, "I'm not parked, I'm sitting." Karen rolled her eyes in that exaggerated, mocking way that made my blood run hot, then marched across the street, her sandals smacking the pavement, her voice rising with each step as she claimed Emily was blocking the flow of foot traffic on the public sidewalk. The street was empty, completely empty, but Karen stood there as if delivering a courtroom argument, her eyes darting over to the neighbor's porch where Mr. Callahan sat pretending to read his newspaper, clearly enjoying the show. I told Karen she needed to calm down, that Emily wasn't hurting anyone, but she doubled down, insisting that rules are rules, and that the HOA had the right to fine us if she reported it. Emily's cheeks flushed pink, her eyes glassy, and for the first time I saw the light in her expression dim, not out of fear, but out of something worse, shame. My stomach twisted. Karen finally spun on her heel and stormed back to her house, muttering something I couldn't quite catch, but I did hear the words lazy and faking. That night, we found a folded slip of paper tucked under our front door, a formal-looking notice printed on HOA letterhead claiming that residents must insure all personal property, including mobility devices, are stored in designated areas when not in use. The absurdity of it made me laugh at first, until I realized someone had gone out of their way to write it, print it, and hand-deliver it, and there was only one person petty enough to do that. I wanted to rip it up and forget it, but the next day, while I was at work, Emily called me in tears. She'd gone outside to get the mail when she noticed Karen sitting in her car across the street, camera pointed directly at her, snapping picture after picture without saying a word. When Emily asked what she was doing, Karen told her she was documenting violations for the HOA. That was the moment something shifted in me, not just irritation, but a cold, simmering anger that made my hands shake. I drove home faster than I should have, and by the time I pulled into the driveway, Karen was gone, but I noticed the blinds in her upstairs window fluttering, just enough to let me know she was watching. Over the next week, the harassment snowballed. We started getting petty citations for things that were either fabricated or so minuscule they were laughable. Garden bed encroaching on HOA boundary, sidewalk not cleared of debris, the debris being a single leaf, mailbox not painted to regulation shade. Every time a letter came, Emily grew quieter, her once bright chatter replaced by long silences where she'd just stare at the garden without touching her sketchbook. Then came the incident with the trash bins. It was Thursday morning, collection day, and I was hauling the bins back to the side of the house when Karen appeared at the end of her driveway with her phone up, recording. "Those bins have been out longer than 24 hours, she called, her voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "That's a violation." I told her to mind her own business and kept walking, but she followed me halfway down the sidewalk, phone still raised, and then this part will stay burned in my memory. She crouched slightly and zoomed in on Emily, who was sitting on the porch watching. "You better hope your little rule breaker over there doesn't get herself in trouble," Karen sneered, before turning and strutting back to her house. That night, when I stepped outside to lock the gate, I noticed something I hadn't before. Small, fresh footprints in the soft dirt of our garden bed, leading right up to the window of Emily's bedroom. They weren't Emily's. She couldn't have made them, even if she tried. My heart thudded in my chest as I traced them with my eyes, realizing they came from the direction of Karen's property. I wanted to call the police right then, but without proof, they'd just shrug it off, maybe even tell me it was probably kids playing around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd crossed from petty harassment into something darker, something dangerous. Emily must have sensed my unease because later, as I tucked her into bed, she asked me in a small voice, "Why does she hate me? I didn't do anything." I swallowed hard and told her it wasn't her fault, but deep down, I knew Karen wasn't the kind of person who needed a reason. She just needed an excuse. And with each passing day, it felt like she was getting closer to finding one. It didn't take long for Karen's petty harassment to evolve into something more sinister, something that seeped into every corner of our lives until even the smallest moments felt tainted by her presence. And it all began with the whispers. At first, I thought I was imagining them, passing comments in the grocery store, quiet murmurs on the sidewalk, but soon it became impossible to ignore. People I'd once exchanged friendly waves with now averted their eyes when I passed, crossing the street to avoid me, their conversations cutting off abruptly, like I'd walked into the middle of something I wasn't meant to hear. It was at the monthly HOA meeting that the truth hit me like a punch to the gut. I walked in, clutching the list of questions I'd been saving about the ridiculous citations we'd been getting, but the room went silent the moment I stepped through the door. Karen sat at the end of the table, her hands folded primly, a faint smirk tugging at her lips, and before I could even take my seat, one of the board members, a man I barely knew, cleared his throat and said, "We've had concerning reports about your daughter's behavior." My heart slammed against my ribs. "What reports?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended, but he just glanced at Karen, who gave a little shrug like she was embarrassed for me, then proceeded to spin a story so outrageous it would have been laughable if the room hadn't been nodding along. According to her, Emily had been seen harassing neighborhood children, blocking public walkways, and even brandishing scissors at a passing jogger. I could barely get a word in, my protests drowned out by her calm, measured tone, the kind of voice that makes lies sound like gospel. When I finally managed to speak, telling them Emily's condition made most of those claims physically impossible, Karen just tilted her head and said, "You'd be surprised what people are capable of when they want attention." The room tittered, and that was the moment I realized she'd been laying the groundwork for this for months, planting seeds of doubt and watching them grow into full-blown suspicion. By the time I left, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely turn the key in the ignition, and the weight of the stairs that followed me out the door made my skin crawl. Over the next few days, the isolation deepened. Kids who used to wave at Emily now whispered behind their hands, some even shouting cruel names when they thought I wasn't listening. Packages we ordered never arrived, or if they did, they were torn open, the contents scattered. One afternoon, I found Emily's wheelchair ramp coated in some kind of sticky, clear liquid, so slick it nearly sent me tumbling. The police came after I insisted on filing a report, but the officer who showed up seemed more interested in lecturing me about keeping the peace than in actually investigating. "It's probably just kids messing around," he said with a shrug, ignoring the fact that the ramp led directly to my disabled daughter's only safe exit from the house. Then there were the noises, strange, fleeting sounds that only seemed to happen after dark. A soft tap on the window one night, a low metallic scrape along the side of the house the next. I started keeping a baseball bat by the door, my sleep broken into restless bursts where I'd jolt awake certain I'd heard footsteps outside. And then one rainy afternoon, Emily came inside clutching a folded piece of paper she'd found wedged into the spokes of her wheelchair. It wasn't typed this time, it was scrawled in thick black marker, the words jagged and uneven. "SHE doesn't belong here." My vision went red. I called the police again, but just like before, they brushed it off, promising to patrol the area, but making it clear they thought I was overreacting. I knew better. Karen wasn't just trying to inconvenience us anymore, she was trying to scare us, to make us so uncomfortable we'd leave. But there was something in her eyes, every time I caught her watching us now, something sharper and more focused, like she wasn't content with driving us out. No, she wanted something more final. That thought kept me awake long after the house had gone quiet. lying there in the dark, staring at the ceiling and wondering how far she was willing to go, and how much time we had left before we found out. It was a Saturday morning, the kind where the sky was a pale, washed out blue, and the air felt heavy with the promise of rain, when I discovered the first undeniable proof that Karen's malice had crossed into something dangerous, something that could have killed my daughter. Emily had been up early, excited to go to a local art fair, her sketchbook already on her lap as she waited for me to load the van, and as I rolled her wheelchair down the ramp, I noticed the right tire wobble strangely. At first, I thought it was just low on air, but when I bent down to check, my stomach dropped. The tire had been cleanly slashed, the cut so precise it could only have been done with a sharp blade. My hands trembled as I examined the other side, finding the same thing. Both tires had been sabotaged and the cuts were fresh. Someone had been here in the last few hours. I scanned the street, and there she was, Karen, standing at her mailbox in a robe, coffee cup in hand, watching me with that smug little smirk. She didn't look away when our eyes met. She didn't even bother pretending to be surprised. She just turned and strolled back toward her house, her robe fluttering in the breeze like nothing at all had happened. My pulse pounded in my ears. If Emily had gone down the ramp without me checking, those tires could have collapsed under her weight, sending her crashing to the pavement or worse, into the street. I called the police immediately, but when the officer arrived, his tone was the same infuriating mix of apathy and condescension. "Hard to prove who did it," he said, crouching to look at the cuts, but making no move to collect evidence. "Could have been an accident." An accident. Two symmetrical, identical slashes. I wanted to scream, but instead I bit my tongue until I tasted blood, because I knew if I lost control, Karen would twist it into something she could use against me. That night, I set up an old motion-activated camera in the garden, angling it toward the ramp and the driveway. It was the only way I could think to protect Emily when I wasn't right beside her. But even that didn't make me feel safe, because the next day, something even more unsettling happened. Emily had been napping in the living room while I worked in the kitchen, and I stepped out to water the marigolds when I caught sight of Karen standing just beyond the property line, talking in low tones to another neighbor I didn't recognize. She was holding something under her arm again, another black case like the one I'd seen weeks ago, and this time I was close enough to notice the way her fingers tightened around it when she saw me. The man she was with glanced at me once, then quickly looked away, muttering something before walking off. Karen, of course, stayed put. "Lovely day," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You keeping your little troublemaker indoors now?" My nails bit into my palms, but I forced myself to turn away without answering. That evening, after Emily was asleep, I reviewed the footage from the garden camera, and my blood ran cold. At 2:17 a.m., the screen showed a grainy figure, slim, robe-like silhouette, stepping into the yard, bending down near the ramp for several seconds, then gliding out of frame. I couldn't see her face, but I didn't need to. I knew. The following week was like living under siege. Twice I caught the faint, chemical smell of gasoline near the garden, though I never found the source. Our mailbox was pried open one night, and a stack of Emily's medical appointment letters were missing. Someone even loosened the bolts on the ramp's railing, something I only discovered when it wobbled dangerously as Emily leaned on it. Every incident made my chest tighter, every sleepless night stretching into dawn with me sitting in the dark, listening for the slightest sound. And through it all, Karen never stopped watching. Sometimes she'd stand in her upstairs window, a pale figure backlit by the glow inside, staring down at our house like she was marking every movement. Other times, she'd be outside, phone in hand, pretending to take photos of her roses while angling the lens toward Emily. I started walking her to the mailbox myself, my eyes scanning every shadow, every parked car. But the worst was yet to come, because one late afternoon, just as the sun dipped low and the sky turned the color of bruised peaches, I saw Karen again, this time at the edge of her driveway, talking to that same man I'd seen before, and there was no mistaking what she was holding. The black case was open and inside was a gun. Not a photograph, not a toy, a Rayall metal gleaming handgun. She looked up at me, and her smile widened in a way that made my stomach flip. That night, I didn't just feel afraid. I knew we were in danger, and I knew that whatever Karen was planning, she was getting ready to make her move. It was the last weekend of October, the air carrying that brittle chill that made the leaves crunch underfoot, and Emily had been begging me all week to let her help hand out candy for Halloween. So I set up a little folding table at the end of the driveway, draped it in a pumpkin print cloth, and arranged bowls of treats so she could reach them from her wheelchair. She was beaming, wearing a little black witch's hat tilted over her auburn hair. When the first kids arrived, their parents smiling and chatting as they lingered on the sidewalk. For the first 20 minutes, it almost felt normal, safe, even until the crowd thinned, and I spotted Karen at the far end of the street, walking toward us with that slow, deliberate stride, her hands buried in the pockets of a long, dark coat. Something about the way she moved made every nerve in my body tighten. Emily noticed too. I could see her smile falter as Karen drew closer, her eyes fixed on my daughter, with an intensity that was almost predatory. She stopped just a few feet away, close enough that I could smell the faint tang of her perfume. And without greeting me, she leaned forward slightly, her gaze never leaving Emily's face. She said, her voice low but sharp enough to cut, "Some people think it's cruel to keep damaged things around." My stomach dropped, and before I could respond, she straightened and added, "They just make everyone uncomfortable. Sooner or later, somebody's going to do something about it." The words were like ice water down my spine. I took a step forward, planting myself between her and Emily, my voice shaking as I told her leave. Karen's lips curved into that infuriating smirk, but there was no humor in her eyes, only something dark and simmering. "You'll regret this," she murmured, almost to herself, before turning and walking away, her coat billowing behind her. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I kept scanning the shadows between trick-or-treaters, every rustle of leaves or burst of laughter making me flinch. When the candy was gone, I wheeled Emily back inside and locked every door and window, my heart still pounding from Karen's words. But the unease didn't fade, it grew. Over the next few days, Karen seemed to be everywhere. She'd appear on the sidewalk while I was unloading groceries, lingering just long enough to make me notice her before disappearing. She'd be parked in her car across the street when Emily came home from therapy, engine idling, her eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. One morning, I opened the curtains to find a dead crow lying on the garden path, its wings spread wide, a deep red smear staining the concrete beneath it. I didn't need a note to know it was a message. Emily was quieter than usual, asking to keep the curtains closed and avoiding the porch entirely. At night, I started hearing the faint sound of footsteps on the gravel outside, but every time I went to check, the yard was empty except once, when I caught the faint glint of something metallic half hidden in the hedge. It was gone by morning. The breaking point came that Thursday afternoon. Emily was on the porch reading while I tidied up inside. When I heard her call my name, her voice high and tight with fear, I ran out to find Karen standing at the base of the porch steps, both hands shoved deep in her coat pockets, staring up at Emily like she was deciding something. "You need to go inside," I told Emily, my own voice sharp with urgency. Karen tilted her head, almost curious, and said, "What's it like knowing you can't protect her forever?" The way she said it, calm, almost conversational, made my blood run cold. I stepped down to meet her at eye level, telling her to get off my property, and that's when she leaned in, close enough that I could feel the heat of her breath and whisper tick-tock. Then she turned and walked away, not looking back once. I stood there frozen, every muscle locked, the sound of my own heartbeat roaring in my ears. In that moment, I knew she wasn't bluffing, and whatever she was planning, it was coming soon. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day that felt deceptively calm. The sky, a soft watercolor of blues and whites, the air crisp enough to make you believe nothing bad could possibly happen. And maybe that was why I let my guard down, why I didn't notice right away that the street had gone strangely quiet, the usual hum of traffic and distant lawnmowers replaced by an unnatural stillness. Emily had just come home from her therapy session, her cheeks flushed from the cool air, and she insisted on going out to the garden to see if the last of her marigolds had survived the changing season. I told her I'd join her in a minute, just needed to put away her sketch pad and grab the mail, but when I stepped out onto the porch moments later, I froze. She was at the far edge of the yard, near the little stone path we'd built together. Her head bent as she reached for a flower, completely unaware of the figure striding toward her from across the street. Karen. Her long coat flared slightly with each step, and her hands were not in her pockets this time. They were steady and deliberate as she carried that same black case I'd seen before. Now unlatched, the metal glint of what was inside catching the sunlight. My mouth went dry. I called out to Emily, my voice cracking with urgency, but the moment she looked up, time seemed to slow in a way I'd only experienced once before, on the day of the accident. Karen's face was a mask of cold determination. Her eyes locked on my daughter like nothing else in the world existed. She stopped just a few feet from her, reached into the case, and, in one fluid motion, pulled out a handgun. The sight of it jolted me into motion. I ran, the world narrowing into the space between the three of us, but the sound came before I could reach them. A single, deafening crack split the air, echoing off the houses like a firework, but there was nothing celebratory in that sound, nothing but finality. Emily's body jerked as the bullet struck her in the side of the head, just above her ear, and for a split second she remained upright, her eyes wide with shock, before crumpling sideways, the wheelchair tipping as she fell to the ground. The world went silent for a heartbeat, my own scream muted in my ears before the chaos rushed in. Neighbors shouting, someone gasping, the metallic scent of blood mingling with the sharp tang of gunpowder. I dropped to my knees beside her, my hands hovering uselessly before pressing to the wound, hot and slick under my fingers. Her eyes were half open, glassy, her breath shallow and ragged. And I kept saying her name over and over, as if the sound could anchor her here, keep her from slipping away. Karen stood above us, the gun still in her hand, her expression eerily calm. She deserved it, she said, her voice carrying with awful clarity over the stunned silence that had fallen around us. You all know she did. She looked at the small crowd gathering at the edge of their driveways, daring them to disagree, and no one spoke, not yet. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, growing louder, but every second felt like an eternity. I couldn't move, couldn't think beyond the desperate rhythm of stay with me, pounding in my skull. A neighbor finally rushed forward to help me keep pressure on the wound, his hands shaking as badly as mine. Karen didn't run. She didn't even flinch when two police cruisers screeched to a halt, officers spilling out with weapons drawn. She simply placed the gun on the ground, stepped back, and clasped her hands behind her head like it was all some kind of twisted formality. As the officers moved in to cuff her, she smiled, actually smiled, and said again she deserved it, this time in a tone so casual it made my stomach turn. Paramedics arrived, their voices a blur of medical jargon as they lifted Emily onto a stretcher, one of them shouting for trauma kit, another checking her pulse and pupils. I ran alongside them to the ambulance, my hands still streaked with her blood, my mind trapped in the moment of that gunshot, the way the sound had seemed to tear the world in two. Just before they closed the doors, I caught sight of Karen in the back of a patrol car, her eyes locked on mine through the glass, her expression unreadable, but her lips twitching upward at the corners. And in that moment, I knew that no matter what happened next, this was far from over. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and despair, the kind of cold sterility that seeps into your bones no matter how many times you try to tell yourself it's just a building, just walls and floors. But as I sat hunched in a hard plastic chair outside the trauma room, hands still trembling, shirt stiff with Emily's dried blood, it felt like the air itself was pressing down on me, suffocating. Through the glass, I could see flashes of movement, nurses rushing in and out, a doctor leaning over her small, motionless body, the beep of the monitors rising and falling like waves I couldn't control. My mind kept replaying the moment of the gunshot in slow motion over and over, every tiny detail burned into me. The way Karen's finger curled around the trigger, the brief flare of sunlight off the metal, the way Emily's eyes widened before the impact threw her sideways. I tried to focus on breathing, on staying upright, but the police officer who finally approached me with a clipboard and a pen seemed determined to pull me straight back into the nightmare. His questions were polite, but pointed. Where exactly had I been standing? Did I see Karen aim? Had Emily said anything to provoke her? The last one made my blood boil, but I swallowed the rage, knowing that losing my temper here wouldn't help Emily. I told him everything, every movement, every word I could remember, and he nodded mechanically, scribbling in his little notebook as if this were just another line in another report. When I asked about Karen, he glanced at his partner before telling me she'd been taken to the station, booked for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. But she was already talking, spinning some kind of story about self-defense, about Emily supposedly lunging at her with a sharp gardening tool. The absurdity of it would have been laughable if it didn't make me want to scream. Emily couldn't even lift her left arm without pain, let alone lunge at anyone. I wanted to storm down to the station to rip apart every word she said, but I was rooted here, chained to the space outside that trauma room until someone told me if my daughter was going to live. Hours bled into each other, the light outside shifting from late afternoon gold to the dim gray of evening, and with each passing minute the knot in my chest tightened. At some point, my phone buzzed relentlessly, texts from neighbors, a call from my sister, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. The only moment I left the hallway was when a nurse insisted I step away to wash my hands, her eyes flicking down to the dried red smears along my wrists, as if seeing them was breaking her own composure. When I returned, I caught sight of a figure at the far end of the corridor, flanked by two officers. Karen. She'd been brought here for some kind of medical evaluation before transfer, but even now, handcuffed, her posture was defiant, her chin raised. She saw me instantly and smiled, a slow, deliberate curl of her lips that made my stomach turn. Then she mouthed something exaggerated enough for me to read it clearly. "You'll see." Before I could react, she was ushered through a door and out of sight, leaving the echo of her presence clinging to me like smoke. A doctor finally emerged from a trauma room, his expression a careful balance between professional detachment and human sympathy. Emily was stable, he said, but the bullet had caused a skull fracture and severe swelling. They'd managed to control the bleeding, but the next 48 hours would be critical. "Prepare yourself," he added gently, and the words hit harder than I expected, knocking the air from my lungs. I was allowed to see her briefly, and the sight nearly undid me. Her head wrapped in thick white bandages, tubes snaking from her arms, the steady hiss of oxygen filling the silence between monitor beeps. I took her hand carefully, terrified of hurting her, and whispered promises I wasn't sure I could keep. That I'd protect her, that I wouldn't let Karen win, that no matter what lies were told, the truth would come out. But even as I said it, I knew the fight was only beginning. Karen was already working the system, twisting her crime into some warped narrative where she was the victim, and the neighborhood, the same people who had seen her pull the trigger, would be her audience. And in this town, where gossip traveled faster than fact, I knew how dangerous that could be. I stayed by Emily's side until the nurses made me leave, retreating to that same hard chair, staring at the closed door of the trauma room, vowing that the next time Karen's name came out of anyone's mouth, it wouldn't be hers telling the story. It would be mine. By the next morning, the quiet hum of hospital machines was replaced by the relentless buzz of my phone, each vibration another sign that Karen's poison was already seeping into the cracks of our neighborhood. Social media posts from local community groups had started popping up, half-truths, outright lies, and vague concerns that somehow painted Karen as a cornered, terrified woman who had feared for her life when confronted by my unpredictable daughter. Some posts claimed Emily had been running wild in Karen's yard with a pair of garden shears. Others insisted she had been threatening Karen for weeks, as if my daughter, who could barely walk without help, had been secretly plotting some violent attack. The sheer absurdity was enough to make my hands shake, but what cut deepest was seeing familiar names under those posts, people who had seen Emily grow up, neighbors who had once smiled at us over barbecue smoke and shared fences, now commenting things like, "Well, we don't know the whole story," or, "Karen's always been so nice to me. I can't imagine her doing something without reason." I wanted to grab each of them by the shoulders and drag them to Emily's hospital bed, make them see the tubes, the bruising, the swelling, but I knew Karen's strategy now: muddy the water, blur the edges, and make everyone question the obvious. Even worse, some of the actual witnesses from the day before were already starting to falter. One woman who had stood on her porch watching the whole thing now told the police she wasn't sure if Emily had something in her hand. Another man, who'd been mowing his lawn when the shot rang out, told an officer he didn't see the moment it happened and couldn't swear to where Emily had been standing. It was textbook: Karen, apply just enough social pressure and intimidation that people would rather fade into uncertainty than stand firm against her. The HOA board's silence was deafening, which in this neighborhood was as good as support. No official statement, no condemnation, nothing. That evening, while I sat by Emily's bed reading through yet another wave of rumors online, a private message came in from an unknown number. "You're making a mistake pushing this," it read. "Drop it before it gets worse for you." There was no signature, but I didn't need one. The phrasing was pure Karen, her brand of veiled threat wrapped in fake concern. I stared at the screen, my pulse pounding, every instinct telling me this was the start of something bigger than just a courtroom fight. Karen wasn't just defending herself, she was waging a campaign to rewrite reality, and she was frighteningly good at it. Later that night, I caught wind of a neighborhood meeting being planned, not at the HOA hall, but at a neighbor's house, the kind of unofficial gathering that could reshape public opinion without a single shred of evidence. I knew Karen would be there, whether physically or by proxy, feeding her side of the story to anyone willing to listen. And with Emily lying unconscious in a hospital bed, I couldn't shake the sickening realization that while I fought to keep my daughter alive, Karen was already out there making sure the world believed she deserved what happened to her. Every lie she spread was another shadow over the truth, another step toward a version of events where my daughter wasn't a victim but a threat, and if I didn't find a way to stop her soon, that version might be the only one anyone remembered. I showed up to the so-called neighborhood meeting with my phone fully charged, a small recorder in my pocket, and a resolve hard enough to cut glass, because deep down I knew this wasn't a meeting, it was an ambush. The moment I stepped into Mark and Linda Haver's oversized living room, the stale air of judgment hit me like a wall. Every chair was already filled, and every pair of eyes turned to me with that mixture of pity and suspicion I'd seen online all week. At the far end of the room, just under the mantel, where a decorative rifle hung like a quiet threat, Karen sat with her legs crossed, and a cup of coffee she didn't drink, her face wearing that infuriating mask of calm innocence. She didn't speak at first, letting the room simmer in awkward silence until Linda, the self-appointed moderator, cleared her throat and said, "We just wanted to hear both sides of the story for the sake of the neighborhood." The trap was instantly clear. This wasn't about facts. It was about cementing Karen's narrative in front of as many witnesses as possible. Before I could respond, a man from the back piped up, "We've all heard Emily was in Karen's yard with some kind of weapon. Is that true?" My jaw tightened, but before I could open my mouth, Karen leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but pitched just loud enough for the whole room. "I don't want to speak ill of anyone's child, but when someone charges at you in your own yard, sometimes you have no choice." The gasps were audible, and I felt the heat crawl up my neck. "That's a lie," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Emily was walking home from the mailbox. She didn't have anything in her hands. She didn't threaten you. Now, Linda interrupted, raising her hands like a referee breaking up a fight. "Let's keep emotions down. We're all neighbors here." That's when I realized I was the only one standing. Karen and the rest sat comfortably, and I was framed as the aggressor just by posture. A few others chimed in, half questions, half accusations, about Emily's temper, about previous incidents no one could name, each one another stone Karen had planted days ago, now being thrown at me by people I'd once considered friends. I pulled out my phone to play the police report recording I'd requested, the one where witnesses initially confirmed Emily had done nothing wrong. But before I could hit play, Mark, our HOA treasurer and a longtime Karen ally, spoke over me. You have to understand, he said, looking around the room as if rallying a jury, we have to think about the safety of the entire community. If there's even a chance Karen acted in self-defense, we can't vilify her. Karen lowered her eyes in a perfect imitation of wounded humility, as if she were the one under attack, and the room's energy shifted further away from me. My heart pounded so hard I could feel in my throat, but I forced myself to speak. Emily is fighting for her life in a hospital bed. I said, because a grown woman pointed a gun at her head and pulled the trigger. You want safety? Start with holding the person who did that accountable. There was a moment of dead silence, the kind that almost feels like a victory, until Karen let out the softest, most calculated sniffle and murmured, I wish I could turn back time, but I can't. All I can do is pray for her recovery and hope her family stops attacking me when I've done nothing but try to live in peace. It was a masterstroke, twisting herself into the victim, making my outrage look like persecution. A couple of people actually clapped. I left before the meeting officially ended, every step feeling like I was walking deeper into enemy territory, because if Karen could control the story in a room full of people who'd known us for years, she could control it anywhere. But as I stepped out into the cool night air, I made a silent promise. I might have lost the room tonight, but the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. I didn't sleep that night, not because of fear, but because I was piecing together every scrap of truth I'd gathered over the last 2 weeks, arranging it like ammunition for a battle I could not afford to lose, and by sunrise, I knew exactly how I was going to end this. The next HOA board meeting was already on the calendar, and this time I walked in not with anger, but with a quiet, unnerving calm, because in my bag was something Karen had never counted on proof. The room was packed again, whispers rippling as I took my seat at the front, and Karen, looking slightly less smug than before, gave me a tight smile as if she still believed she controlled the narrative. Mark began the usual introductions, but before he could open the floor, I stood and said, before we start, I have something every single person here needs to see. And once you see it, there will be no more questions about what really happened to my daughter. I reached into my bag, pulled out a small projector, and connected it to my phone. The first video clip hit the wall like a gunshot, security footage from the Johnsons' porch camera across the street, showing Emily small and fragile, walking along the sidewalk with nothing in her hands, her pace slow and uneven from her disability. The timestamp matched the day of the shooting. Then Karen appeared in the frame, storming out of her yard with a handgun already drawn, screaming words the camera's microphone barely caught. Get out of here, before I make you. The room went dead silent. I let the footage run, showing Karen aiming directly at Emily, who froze in fear before the shot rang out and she crumpled to the ground. A couple of people gasped audibly, and Linda's hand flew to her mouth. I didn't stop there. I played the second clip, audio from a neighbor's Ring doorbell, where Karen's voice, breathless and unfiltered, muttered, "That'll teach her to trespass," right after the shot. Then I pulled up the last piece, a screenshot of the original police incident report, clearly stating that 2 eyewitnesses confirmed Emily never stepped onto Karen's property and was unarmed, but that this statement had been edited in the final public version. I let the weight of it hang in the air, every tick of a wall clock pounding like a drumbeat of justice finally catching up. Karen's face drained of color, and for the first time, her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat, looking anywhere but at me, and Linda's voice cracked as she tried to say, we need to let the authorities handle, but I cut her off, my voice cold and sharp. They will, because this, I held up a flash drive, has already been sent to the police, the DA's office, and every local news station within 50 miles. The only reason I'm showing it here tonight is so you all can remember exactly what you defended, what you excused, and what you tried to bury. A murmur swept through the crowd, anger, shame, shock, and someone in the back shouted, "Arrest her!" Karen finally found her voice, but it was a pathetic, stammering thing. This is taken out of context, you don't understand, but no one was listening anymore. 2 people actually stood up and walked out rather than be in the same room with her. I gathered my things slowly, deliberately, never breaking eye contact with her as I said, "The difference between you and me, Karen, is that I have the truth. And the truth doesn't need to hide behind lies or tears or HOA meetings. Then I walked out into the cool night air again, but this time my steps were lighter, not because the fight was over, but because I'd turned tide. For once, it wasn't me on the defensive, it was her. And no matter how hard she tried, the whole world was about to see her for exactly what she was.